Hello, everyone. My name is Kaja Rønsdal, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third webinar in the Migration, Ethics and Theology webinar series. This series is developed in a cooperation between the Scalabrini International Migration Institute in Rome and scholars in the research project Nordhost, Migration and Hospitality in the Nordic Context. The topics for today's webinar is climate change and human displacement, concerning the impact of climate change and crisis on human displacement, and who is expected to respond to the climate crisis. This was to be an interdisciplinary discussion between moral philosophy and theology, but unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Professor Arne Johan Vetlesen had to cancel just a couple of hours ago. Brother Jostrom Kuritadam have generously offered to extend his presentation. This also leaves a little bit more time for discussion and questions after the presentation. So we are confident we will still have a challenging and stimulating webinar. So welcome again. I will now give the words to today's moderator, Veronica De Sanctis, who is Research and Communication Manager for the Scalabrini International Migration Institute.
Thank you, Kaja. Thank you also for taking charge of presenting everyone. And my duty now for today is greeting you for being with us and leaving the floor to our main speaker, Father Jostrom Isaac Kuritadam. He's Chair of Philosophy of Science and Director of the Institute of Social and Political Science at the Salesian Pontifical University here in Rome. He was the coordinator of the sector of ecology at the Vatican Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development from 2017 to 2023, where he continues to serve while attending to numerous academic commitments. So I'm happy to leave the floor to Father Kuritadam for his presentation. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so very much, Veronica, and good afternoon to everyone. Thanks to the Scalabrini family and to the Oslo University for hosting this very important webinar on such a relevant theme, climate crisis and human displacement. Please allow me to share with you a short PowerPoint presentation I have prepared for the occasion. I use the word climate crisis rather than climate change, and I will explain in the course of my presentation why we use the term crisis. And I've been asked to reflect on this theme with special reference to two documents that Pope Francis gifted us, Laudato Si, an encyclical that was published in 2015. And just last year, on the 4th of October, Pope Francis followed up with another exhortation named Laudate Deum. So I will base my reflections, especially at the beginning, on these two documents. Laudato Si, as I said, was released in 2015, and the reception it received from the international community was extraordinary. I remember hardly 2 weeks after the encyclical was published, a secular scientist, professor at the New York State University, Dale Jamieson, wrote that this is the most important environmental text of the 21st century. To say that of a papal document is indeed very, very praiseworthy, because Laudato Si confronts, addresses a very important challenge. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis invites the churches, religions, and all people of goodwill. That's the beauty of Laudato Si. It's not just addressed to church people, not even to believers. It's addressed to all people of goodwill, where Pope Francis invites us to care for our fragile planetary home before it is too late. To quote the Pope, I urgently appeal then for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. And one of the beautiful paradigm changes the Laudato Si brings about is offering us a new vision. It's not just environment, but it is about our common home and this integral vision. In Laudato Si, paragraph 66, Pope Francis writes that human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships. And this is the core of Laudato Si, sort of a mantra that we find throughout the encyclical, that everything is related. Here in this metaphysical vision, if I might say, he says we exist in relationships with God, with our neighbor, and with earth itself. Probably the third dimension has been a bit overlooked. And Pope Francis says, no, we are earthly beings. So that is, very crisply to introduce Laudato Si. Then 8 years later, in 2023, just before the climate COP in Dubai, Pope Francis released Laudate Deum. It's not an encyclical, so it's not the same level of Laudato Si, but it's an exhortation, which is sort of a lower level of papal teaching, but both are important, where he uses the word climate crisis. So when I use climate crisis, in a way we are following Pope Francis. And this exhortation, Laudato Si, was on everything connected to ecology, whereas Laudate Deum is very focused just on the climate crisis. And again, to quote Pope Francis, he begins the Laudate Deum right in the second paragraph at the beginning. Pope Francis says, 8 years have passed since I published the encyclical letter Laudato Si, when I wanted to share with all of you, my brothers and sisters of our suffering planet, my heartfelt concerns about the care of our common home. Yet, with the passage of time, I have realized that our responses have not been adequate. So these are very strong words. Pope Francis, I wrote Laudato Si with a lot of hope, but after 80 years, I realized we have not, as international community, responded to this challenge. And again, even stronger words used by the Pope, that while the world in which we live is collapsing, now he's telling us that our common home, in Laudato Si, Pope Francis, the subtitle was on the care for our common home. And here in Laudate Deum, he tells us that this common home appears to be collapsing and maybe nearing the breaking point. So Laudate Deum, it's sort of a heartfelt appeal from the heart of Pope Francis, saying that, please listen to me, let's do something together. So this is, the reason I would like to base my reflections on climate crisis and human displacement in the light of these two papal documents, Laudato Si of 2015 and Laudate Deum of 2023. This afternoon, I would like to offer 3 reflections. First of all, this insight of Laudato Si, of looking at the earth as our common home. A second point where I will spend most time will be about human displacement and the link with the climate crisis. And thirdly, sort of by way of conclusion, what we can do. And one project that Pope Francis himself, that the Vatican has launched in response to the climate crisis and also to Laudato Si in 2021. So the very first theme we would like to reflect is the importance of rediscovering Earth as our common home. As I mentioned, Laudato Si has this beautiful subtitle, on care for our common home. Because for many decades, he spoke about environmental problems, environmental issues. But Pope Francis takes us to a deeper level. He says, be careful, because environment, sometimes we think of it as something external to us, environment, outside of us. He says, we are dealing with something much bigger, something even more important about our own home. And if my home, my house is crumbling, I cannot sit back. I will be worried. I will jump into action. And that's what Pope Francis reminds us. And I teach, I've been teaching for nearly 25 years. Even this morning, I had classes at the Salesian University. I'm chair of cosmology. And some of you would have guessed, this is the latest telescope that nearly 2 years ago we have placed in space, called the James Webb Telescope. Imagine that is like, 4 times distant than the moon. And it's opening for us, a view of the universe that was never possible before. And this is, just one image of the James Webb Telescope, where you can see hundreds of even galaxies in the background, and millions of stars. And it's good to remember, because we live in a cosmic home which is immensely huge. They say the diameter of the observable universe is something like 93 billion light years. Imagine light traveling from one end to the universe to the other end. It will take something like 93 billion light years, in spite of the fact that light is the fastest traveling object in the world. It's 300,000 kilometers a second. In spite of that, it would take 93 billion light years. Imagine, and the universe contains something like 93, something like 2 trillion galaxies. Imagine, 2 trillion. That's 2,000 billion galaxies, like our own Milky Way. And each galaxy contains an average of 200 to 250 billion stars, like our sun. And around the stars, we have a planet like our own Earth. And this is our own beautiful planet. Some of you would remember this photograph, probably the most famous photograph in human history, this photo was taken by Apollo 8, not the expedition which finally landed on the moon, but the penultimate one. And their job was to photograph the moon, exactly where to land. And they were photographing the moon, and by chance, on the horizon, they found the Earth rising. So it is called the Earth rise, just as we say about the sunrise. And I invite you to, just for a few seconds, just to contemplate, this, what I call our selfie. It's we taking a photograph of ourselves in space. It's so beautiful, this white, blue-green jewel, where we don't see borders or continents, where we are all together as one home. And the more we learn, we study cosmology, we realize that Earth happens to be, this is what astronomers, astrophysics tell us, that we happen to be in the habitable, in the right at the right distance from our own mother star. There are 8 planets. From the sun has our solar family. We are made up of 8 planets. Pluto has been declassed since 2013, so we are just 8 planets. And imagine there is around every star, there is what we call a habitable zone. And Earth is just in the right place. If you're too close, it will be too hot. So we won't have liquid water, for example. If you're a bit far away, it'd be too cold, like Mars. And it's interesting, the Venus, which is closer to the sun, Venus has an average temperature of 460 degrees centigrade, imagine. And Mars is minus 120. So, we are in the right place. And it's just not for the place. What really makes life flourish possible, and life to flourish on Earth, is what we call the greenhouse effect. In fact, even though we are in the right place, without the greenhouse effect, Earth's average temperature would be minus 18 degrees. Right now, the average temperature is like 14.5 degrees centigrade for the entire planet. So without the greenhouse effect, there'll be difference of nearly 36 degrees. So, and what makes life flourish is that we have the right greenhouse effect. We have, as we know, the atmosphere is composed of 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and just below 1% are what we call the greenhouse gases. So it's a very small quantity. But what's happening, as you can see on the right, is that we are emitting CO2, nitrous oxide, methane, so many CFCs, so many of this, especially CO2 from the combustion of fossil fuels that we are emitting, that we are heating up. So this is explaining climate crisis, climate change in very simple terms. We already have a naturally occurring greenhouse effect, but we are putting, due to human activities, too much of greenhouse gases, and the planet is suffering. Now, going back to Laudato Si, Laudato Si speaks of Earth as our common home. And this is one insight I discovered in prayer, and in a small little commentary I wrote on Laudato Si called the 10 Green Commandments. I begin with this reflection that Pope Francis took the name of Francis, Saint Francis of Assisi. And some of you might know that Francis of Assisi, he lives in 1200, and this particular event occurs in 1206. He was disappointed with life, like many young people, left home, and he was wandering around. And nearly a month ago, I was in Assisi. I usually go there at least 3-4 times a year. And there's the Church of Saint Damiano, a small little chapel, where Saint Francis entered. And the crucified Lord spoke to him, said, "Francis, go and repair my house, which you see is falling into ruin." So Francis begins to repair that house. Then later, Saint Bonaventure, writing the life of Francis, says, the house that the Lord wanted him to repair was not just a chapel, but the entire church. And here is the connection. 8 centuries later, another Francis comes onto the scene. It's a very funny slide. You can see some of you smiling. But then it is again the second Francis receiving a similar command from the Lord. Some of you, I'm sure, speak Italian. Francesco va e ripara la nostra casa. He says, Francis, go and repair our home. So this is the first point I want to reflect with you, that we are dealing with a crisis of our common home. And Earth is our home. And we are talking about displacement, about migration, that people are being pushed out from where they live, whereas all of us are destined to live peacefully, happily in this common home. And this common home is what we are destroying. And some of our sisters and brothers suffering more than others. We'll come to that. So with that, I go to the heart of my presentation, the second point of the 3 points, climate crisis and human displacement. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis offers what we call an integral, a holistic understanding of the ecological crisis, oikos logos, the crisis of our common home. But the originality of Pope Francis is that he asks us to listen to both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, because the Pope says, today, however, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment. That's the reason, I suppose, the Scalabrinian family by a university like the Oslo University is dealing with these issues, because it's also about justice. It's about human flourishing. And Pope Francis says we need to listen, hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Allow me to dwell a bit on both these cries before we go to the problem of human displacement. The cry of the earth, this is a study entitled Planetary Boundaries. It was brought out by Stockholm Environment Institute, one of the most prestigious institutes, where 28 researchers, many of them Nobel laureates like Paul Crutzen and others, they came together. And they came out with a study. Now, this 2009, when they first released the study, out of 9 areas, in 3 areas, we had gone beyond the green zone. You can see at the center, there is the green zone, and the green is the safe zone. So we should have remained there. Already in 2009, in 3 areas, climate, biodiversity, and use agriculture, we had moved out. 2015, there was the land use area had come in. And what really, pains us is that 2023, the report says, the study says, out of 9, in 6 areas, we are in danger. We have moved beyond the green zone into the red zone. So just one study saying that the earth is crying out. Another study is what we call the ecological footprint analysis. Earth is limited, earth is finite, and earth as a mother feeds us, nurtures us, but her resources are limited. But the problem is we are consuming, and this started in the 1970s, that we started over consuming. And right now, we consume something like 1.7 planets a year. So we are robbing future generations. We are also robbing from our own sisters and brothers. Now, this study just came out a few weeks ago. It shows in 2024, if I were to live in Qatar, by 11th of February, I have already consumed all that is available renewably, which means if I were to live in Qatar, I consume something like 9 planets a year. And Qatar is being sometimes projected as a sustainable city, but it's all just greenwashing. It's these or Dubai, or these are places where sustainable living is impossible. Then you come up the list, and Luxembourg, UAE, United States of America, they consume something like 5 planets a year. Most of us, I speak from Rome. In Europe, we consume 3 planets a year. And some of you may be coming from countries which are not on this list. And congratulations, because you are living sustainable. Most of the African countries are not on the list. Most of the Asian, Latin American countries, because they still live sustainably. They still live virtuously, if I might say, But this is unsustainable. And they're saying if things go like this, within 10 years or so, we require another planet altogether, which we don't have. So then we are taking more from others what is shared. But even worse, we are robbing, stealing from future generations. And the most important challenge right now is the climate crisis. I usually use this slide with my students because I find it's pedagogically very appealing, because people say, especially climate, skeptics, weather has changed in the past. It's true. Here we have the temperature rise of last 1,000 years, and you see the temperature goes up and down. But if you were to come to the year 2000 and our century, we have reached levels that never happened in the past, and especially what could come by the end of the century. It's really worrying. Imagine, we live in an interglacial epoch that began something like 12,000 years ago. And a glacial epoch lasts something like 100,000 years, which happens due to 3 astronomical factors. The cosmologist in me is coming out, but I should be not talking too much. But then on that, so we live in glacial epochs, and right now we are in interglacial epoch. Imagine last 10, 12,000 years, Earth's average temperature did not vary by more than 1 degree. Earth's average temperature, that's 12,000 years. Now, by the end of the century, we are walking towards 2.7 degrees centigrade. Imagine 10,000 years, Earth's temperature did not vary by more than 1 degree. And in few decades, we could reach 2.7. That's the present calculation. That's the reason in Paris we said we need to make sure, do everything possible to make sure that we don't shoot the 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold. because in a way we are already committed to it, because CO2 in the atmosphere remains, as most of us would know, at least 100 years. Now, 1.5 means nearly 50% worse than today. Because from 1850 up to today, the temperature has already risen by 1.2 degrees centigrade, and we are seeing impacts around the world. So 1.3, 1.4, 1.5 means much worse than today. But the sad or the bad news is as of now, we are walking towards 2.7 degrees centigrade. God save us, But then now going from the cry of the earth to the cry of the poor, the problem is, who are the ones affected most are the poor. Pope Francis writes in Laudato Si that both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. And studying Laudato Si, it struck me that Laudato Si is not an environmental green encyclical. Pope Francis himself has repeated it several. I heard it from his own mouth. He has said that it's a social encyclical, because it's not even about climate change. The word climate is mentioned 14 times, while the word poor 59 times. So you can see where the heart of the encyclical lies. Pope Francis is worried about the climate crisis, all these challenges, because it affects the poor most. And as we shall see, they have not contributed to the problem. Because the ecological problems, climate crisis in particular, affect food security. This is a woman from South America. I don't know among our speakers, anybody from South America. It's affecting all over food security. When we have droughts or floods, food production goes down. It affects human health. Now, this is from Bangladesh, and I remember a missionary once telling us that when they have the floods, monsoon rains, sometimes water can remain for months, 2 or 3 months. So imagine people living in those homes. And doctors, for example, tell us that dirty water kills more children than all the other diseases put together. Then migration. So, and this is maybe a very important argument, to make, that climate crisis affects human welfare in all 3 fundamental sectors. It affects our food security. All of us have a right to live, right to nutrition, right to be fed. All of us have right to health, decent health, and all of us have a right to a shelter. These are basic human rights, and this is what life possible. This is about human dignity. And ecological crisis and the climate crisis in particular affects all these areas of human welfare, all these human rights. And so this is a question of human rights. Let's now deepen. So I spoke about the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. It affects human dignity. Let's now deepen our argument today, how it affects human displacement, how it leads to human displacement. This is a study that came out in 2020, and IPCC last year picked it up again. And this is shocking, because right now the study says 0.8% of the global land, say 1% of the global land surface is unlivable because it's so hot. You can see Sahara, Saudi Arabia, some parts, it's all in the tropical belt. And this study says that by 2070, 19% of the planet's surface will be unlivable. Allow me to share a personal experience, because personally, as much as I was there, just before the COP summit in Glasgow, our dicastery, along with the Secretariat of State and the UK embassy government, we managed to organize at the Vatican a very important meeting of faith leaders. Nearly 40, we worked an entire year to get that meeting in place. And in the end, they all came to the Vatican at the invitation of Pope Francis. And there was a summit just a few weeks before the COP in Glasgow, hoping that, that can create greater public awareness. And all the faith leaders, beginning with Pope Francis, spoke. But what I still remember of that meeting is that at the end, the president of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences spoke, a certain Professor Joachim von Braun. And Professor von Braun said, I listened to all of you faith leaders, but he said something very personal. He said, I am thinking today of my granddaughter, and he's by name Emma. And he said, Emma has just, celebrated her first birthday. And he said, I know as a scientist that if you don't do anything, by the time Emma will have my age, around 60 years old, some parts of the planet will be unlivable. And this study takes me to that. And, by 2670, and we are in 2024, another 36 years, that 19% of the planet will be unlivable. And this is happening. I'm sure you're familiar that a few weeks ago, before Easter in South Sudan, they had to close down schools, at least for 2 weeks, because it's so hot. So children could not come out in the sun. And imagine the poor people, farmers who are to work, they don't find everything in the fridge, as some of us might find. And last week I was reading that in the Philippines, in Manila, they closed down schools because it's so hot. So in a way, nature is anticipating us. It's moving faster than what we ourselves thought. So we are walking into the situations. At the Vatican, Brother Jokina will know that earlier we had a section. I was coordinating the ecology section. We also had a migration section. And 3 years ago, in 2021, we did a study together called Climate Crisis and Human Displacement with pastoral orientations. And that study begins with this quotation. The climate crisis has a very human face. It is already a reality for multitudes of vulnerable people worldwide. The Catholic Church shows a warm pastoral care for those who have been displaced from their homes by its effects. So people are already displaced. The pastoral orientations on climate displaced people explains the new challenges posed by the disturbing, perilous phenomena of climate disruption in many parts of the globe and suggests appropriate pastoral responses. I purposely took not English to show that it came out in many languages, this document. Since the other professor is missing, maybe some background information, how does ecological factors contribute to displacement? And we can group them into, there are myriads of factors, so many factors, a myriad of factors which can force displacement, but we can put them in two categories, what we call rapid onset triggers, especially extreme weather phenomena like floods and storms and droughts and wildfire. You lose your home and you have to move out. And what we call even more dangerously, slow onset processes like land and ecosystem degradation, depletion of natural resources, desertification, and sea level rise. Why I said the second group is more serious, because in the first case, or you had a flood, it's true that there's a lot of damage, but you can go back, most cases, or a drought, rains come, you go back to the place. But in the case of desertification, sea level rise, there's no place to go back. So of these many factors, the second group is what is more challenging. And today, the climate crisis is considered a primary global driver of migration. Interesting, when we did the study with the migration group in the dicastery, one of the conclusions was precisely this, that today, ecological factors cause 3 to 10 times more displacement than even political factors like conflicts or wars. Imagine. In the coming decades, people will be displaced because of climatic ecological factors. I don't want to read all those figures there. What happened between 2008 and 2018. that by 2020 alone, we had over 30.7 million people displaced due to natural disasters. And 2023, just last year, the IPCC report saying that right now 3 billion people out of 8 billion, that's very worrying. They live in places that are highly vulnerable to climate breakdown and weather extremes, and are increasingly driving displacement of people, especially in Africa, Asia, North America, Central and South America, and especially small island states. I'll come to that also later. And you know, I began cosmologically speaking about, you know, how Earth is special, especially because we have the right climate, you know, right temperature. And not everywhere on Earth is ideal or is good for us to live. You know, in Siberia or would be very difficult. Also in very hot places in the Sahara Desert, it'd be very difficult. So that is what we call a climate niche, you know, the temperature range within which we can live. But climate change has already put 9% of people, already 600 million people outside this niche. By end of century, 2080, 2100, current policies leading to around 2.7, that's what we're expecting, between 22 to 39% of people that's more than 1/3 of people who would be forced to live in very hot places where living will be next to impossible. You know, yesterday, I come from India originally, so yesterday I was speaking with somebody in the mission area where I worked, and they said it's not in summer, it's 44.5 degrees centigrade. And this is happening around the world. You know, the people, so we are moving out of the ideal climate niche in many places. And I spoke about sea level rise. This is a very, very worry, especially when we go for COP meetings. I find the most vociferous, most worried people are those coming from small island states that are like some 40 of them, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Maldives, and many others, Fiji Islands. Because they're already, for them, when we were in Glasgow, I remember, I think Marshall Islands Prime Minister said, for us, beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade is death sentence. Because if you have to go beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade, most of the small island states are going to go underwater. And that is permanent displacement. And we know at the political level how much of resistance there is to accept those who have been displaced by climate crisis. Right? In fact, the sad thing is they are nowhere covered in international law. And especially people from low-lying islands and atolls will be rendered completely uninhabitable. And you can see statistics there. And no other form of ecological migration will likely be as permanent as that caused by climate-induced sea level rise. And it's already happening in places like Fiji, Vanuatu, Kiribati, the smaller Solomon Islands, and elsewhere. And yeah, this was, I forget, before one of the COPs, you know, they were protesting. We are not drowning, we are fighting. Yeah, but then this is already happening. Human civilization faces unprecedented threats from multi-century sea level rise. You know, this is something what I tell my students. You know, I will also come to that. If you go beyond certain tipping points, we cannot come back. You know, in fact, the Greenland is melting. If you go beyond 1.52 degrees centigrade, we have lost Greenland, which will keep on melting for millennia, for thousands of years. And Greenland alone means 7.2 meters of sea level rise in the centuries to come. So we are really not aware of what we are causing, because the sea level rise will carry on. We cannot close it like we closing or shutting down a pipe. It will carry on. That's the reason 2023 United Nations Security Council had a special meeting on this. And towards the end of this paragraph, I quote the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who, by the way, is very much committed. And like Pope Francis, one of the few voices among global leaders speaking out for the poor, speaking about the climate crisis. He says we would witness a mass exodus of entire populations on a biblical scale, and we would see ever fiercer competition for fresh water, land, and other resources. The sad thing is, doesn't affect everyone. You know, when sea levels rise, it's not the same as in Bangladesh or as someone in Florida. It's not the same as in some of you are in Holland, Netherlands. It won't be the same as in Kiribati. The poor will be affected most. It will hit the poor most. People in the least developed countries and island states will be affected first and worst. And this is, you know, I also want to share this, you know, especially in the West, you know, we say, you know, there's a danger, we will be swamped by climate migrants. Now, most poor people won't have the resources to move out of their lands. They will remain where they are. So when extreme right-wing politicians, you know, say we need to shut down ports and close the borders, it's just greenwashing in political terms. The poor people won't have any, so they'll have to remain where they are or move internally. Many people are so poor that there's nowhere they could migrate to, even despite the worst ravages of environmental degradation and climate crisis. Yeah, and they are suffering disproportionately. Some of you might be familiar with a study that came out in the Lancet magazine. It's a magazine for medical practitioners, doctors and nurses, medical students, which is very good. It speaks so, it's good in the sense it's so clear. It speaks of the ecological climate apartheid, and the expression was used for the first time by Desmond Tutu, you know, whom we know is a champion against political apartheid. He said, and so the magazine, quoting his expression, came out with a study. You see two worlds there. On the top, we have a map of the world according to emissions. You know, countries emitting most. You see the US is so conspicuous, Europe is so conspicuous, China, India probably also because of the population. And the sad thing is you don't see Africa on the top, which is sad. It's also not just. Below, we have emissions according to mortality. People dying, literally dying due to the climate crisis. And you see Africa is so conspicuous, India, South America to an extent, but Africa especially. And Africa, there are over 1 billion people, but Africa contributes something like 4% of global emissions. So this is a very unjust situation. And it's just not global south and north. You know, I said I come from India, and in the city of Mumbai, these are two photographs of the city of Mumbai. On top, again, the apartheid. You know, on the top we find the house of the richest man in Asia. He's the 9th richest in the world. Some of you would know by name Ambani. He has a house of 27 floors. Imagine, he and his family, 5 and 3 kids, 27 floors. And he causes emissions like 1,700 households in terms of electricity. And below, you have another part of the city of Mumbai, where we have the largest slum in Asia, where 1 million people live, you know, yeah, in such a tiny area. And so it's not just north and south. The problem is we have a tiny minority consuming too much, polluting too much. So this is the 2023 Global Inequality Report saying that top 1% of people emit as much as 66% of humanity. And the top 10% emit as much as 50% of humanity. So, and this is unjust. The middle class emit something like 43%, and the poor half of humanity. And I began by saying that Earth is a common home, and it's not just in a common home. Someone emits much more than what is one's share, and the poor emit something like 8%, between 5 to 8 it is. So this is the global inequality in which we live. And speaking from a Catholic perspective, this is done by an artist from the Philippines. the Last Supper, where not everyone has the same resources, and it's very sad, but even now studies say after COVID especially that 823 million people go hungry every day, So this is the unjust situation in which we live. So with that, I go to my third part, and it's very just by conclusion. So I began by saying that Earth is our common home, and quoting Laudato Si, which has the subtitle on Earth as our common home, on caring for our common home. Then we saw how we should listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, because the climate crisis affects food security, health, especially our theme today, displacement, migration, shelter. And we saw the reasons why migration takes place and the challenges facing us in this decade. And at the heart of such injustices, the huge human inequality that is not caused by the poor, but they are the ones who are suffering most. But I want to conclude on a note of hope that we can still act and we need to act. And so this is one of the many projects. So this is one of Pope Francis' favorite projects. So he himself was the one who launched it, what we call the Laudato Si Action Platform. Because if our common home is crumbling, as Pope Francis reminded us in Laudate Deum last year, that this home is reaching a breaking point. So we need everyone, what in the church we call a synodal journey, walking together. So we proposed, a Laudato Si Action Platform. In fact, we began in 2018 when this study about the tipping points came out. Here you see what scientific community is worried is that if we don't do anything, in few years we could, and especially if you go beyond 1.52 degrees centigrade, we will cross most of these tipping points. I mentioned about the Greenland, the Amazon rainforest, West Antarctica, the monsoon rains. There's so many of them. And they are all connected. I also said, Laudato Si says, everything is connected. Some time ago, I was reading how the Amazon affects how much of snow falls on the Himalayas, right across. How much the Amazon can affect the West Antarctic ice sheet. So everything is connected. But the challenge is also, as Pope Francis reminds us in Laudato Si, what kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to children who are now growing up? And children are, just this morning I got up in the radio, tomorrow the European Court is considering a case advanced by 6 young people from Portugal against all the 33 European countries, saying that the governments are not doing sufficiently for the climate. And 2 more cases are going to come up, so watch out. But the youth and climate children are worried. So we proposed a 7-year journey. Politicians say by 2070 we will do it, by 2060. What we have is just a decade. So we are inviting everyone, families, and we played around this number 7. It's a very biblical number. 7 means fullness. So we thought involving everyone, families, parishes, dioceses, schools, universities, and all are welcome. So even the Oslo University is welcome. And we have nearly 200 universities have already joined, hospitals, healthcare centers, businesses, farms, NGOs, movements, religious orders like the Scalabrinians, the Franciscans, Jesuits, Salesians, my own religious order, and they are all joined. So in 7 years, then we propose 7 Laudato Si goals, like the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. So when you join, you have to respond holistically. So education, spirituality, economics, because SDGs we found have not been effective. Let's be honest. And so we are proposing deeper goals. And I want to conclude on this note of hope. I've just taken 45 minutes with Chucky, so I'm in time, I think. So we began 2021, and we are asking with each year new people to join. And what gives us inspiration, hope, is what we call critical mass. When we began this program, we were inspired by a study from Harvard University that said no changes ever come in the history of humanity from above. All changes have been from below. and what Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and one example, I'm sure some of you are from Germany, is how they quote how the Berlin Wall came down, is because young people came together and their numbers grew and they reached the critical mass. And the good news is that the critical mass is not a big number. They say if you have 3.5% of a group, we have the critical mass for change. So we are hoping in 10 years, we can get at least 300 million people. Then for societal change, we need something like 21 to 25%. That's more demanding. But once the critical mass is reached, change is inevitable. We can work towards that. So there is hope, but time is running out. And we need to do everything possible to meet the challenge of the climate crisis and human displacement, which is one of the major impacts of the climate crisis. Thank you so very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Father Trostrom. And thank you for this very, very rich and detailed presentation and providing us with these three different levels of reflection on the documents of Pope Francis and his idea of integral human development, connecting it with the issue of human displacement and understanding the patterns of migration that are expected for the future, as well as for what can we do as persons and parishes and governments. So now we have a few minutes for a question and answer session from our participants. And it is important for me to remind everyone that this is a recording webinar. And therefore, if you want to ask for a question, just be aware that you have been recorded. And if you don't want to open your camera, you can send a message on the chat and I can read it for you. This is a very brief question and answer session before I leave the floor to our closing remarks from Gioacchino Campese, also member of the Scalabrians. While we are waiting for our participant maybe to think about a question, how I was thinking about what we can do, and in the list of the acting entities that can do something also from the church, there are parishes and dioceses. So how member of the parishes, lay people from the parishes, can they approach actually the dioceses or the parishes if they still didn't, they are not yet in the path of doing something? How can they do?
Yeah, Veronica, you want me to respond?
Yes, please. Yes, in the meantime, yes.
Yeah, I would say at two levels, because after working all this, I still work in the dicastery. What I realize is the awareness is still very, very shallow, so I'm happy that university like Oslo University is partnering this webinar, because we need to create this awareness. Because on the other hand, we have oil companies and others spending billions to create environmental skepticism, or just saying, there's no problem, and but then, as I said, nature is sending us very, very clear signals. So at one level, I think it's so important to raise awareness, to have webinars, discussions like this, and the second level, we need to act, and lifestyle changes are so important. And that's the reason, like, after 3 years of work in partnership with many people, we proposed the Laudato Si Action platform, where a family can join, a parish can join, a school can join, and we have thousands of schools. But what I'm still worried is we are still a very, very tiny fraction. We are nowhere near the challenge. So we really need to raise this participation, but people can act, and I think the challenge is walking the talk. So it's also about making sacrifices, but in the positive sense. I'm a priest, and I always think of what Jesus said is Beatitudes, Matthew 5:5. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. And I think we need to recover that simplicity. We need sufficient to live with dignity. When this morning I was telling the students that in Europe, we consume nearly half of per capita resources in the US. But happiness levels in US are anytime higher than in Europe are higher than the US. So it's not the amount of things we consume or we process that make us happy. We need a certain level to live with dignity. Beyond that is only creating unhappiness. So how to provide, how to change lifestyles. And there I think it's important to challenge, especially the super rich. I mentioned about the very rich man in Mumbai. A few weeks ago, his third son got married. And you won't believe me, they spent for 3 days of wedding feast, $130 million. And this is the way the rich people are living, and and the youth are getting frustrated. So creating awareness means also discussing about these issues and acting. And thank God we have the solutions. What's important is that we are willing to change. But I don't want to speak too much, so we have other questions.
Thank you. Yes, we have a question from Sir Zan Akologo. I hope I pronounce it well. Please.
Okay, so thank you very much. My apologies. I will not activate my video because I'm in a very private environment. Next one, I just wanted to appreciate Father Josh, as I call him, for his profound knowledge and deep commitment to sharing this knowledge that inspires action. Father Josh, good to see your face again, albeit virtual. As I call myself an apostle of Laudato Si, I'm always interested in learning about what other actions can we take. And of course, Father Joss has talked about the need to create that critical mass that will work for the change. He did talk about the Laudato Si platform, which I'm very familiar with at the dicastery. But beyond that, Father Joss, do you have other good examples, best practices of organizing, especially in Asia and Africa, that can create this critical change that we need? This critical mass that we need to work towards the change. Because sometimes it's a bit frustrating that we don't seem to be moving at the speed that will be commensurate to the destruction that we are witnessing. Sorry for going on too long. Back to you, moderator. Thank you for the opportunity. I hope you heard me.
Yeah, I did, and thank you, Zan. Thank you for the brilliant question, Zan. And thank you for all that you are doing to promote the vision of Laudato Si. Yeah, and I too share your level of frustration, because with a bit of scientific background, I'm really getting worried, because the nature is moving faster than what we thought. And I quoted the example of South Sudan, the children being able to move out. And these things are happening faster than what we expected. So what can we do? Since you mentioned about in Africa and Asia, immediately 2-3 names came to my mind. In Nairobi, we have SINUSA, Catholic Youth Network for Environmental Sustainability. They're all over Africa. And the beauty of it, it's a youth organization. The young people coming out with solutions, and they're also partners of the Laudato Si Action platform. And the beauty of bottom-up approaches, we can find our own solutions. And something very practical is solar energy, for example. And going to Asia, I remember I'm a Salesian priest. 3 years ago, we had a Laudato Si year. And one of our superiors asked all the 35 communities, they have schools and parishes, to switch to solar energy. It was a bit expensive, but they got help from elsewhere. This is where I see where global north and south need to work together. It's not just charity, it's justice. So allowing a school in the Philippines or in Sri Lanka to have solar energy is also a duty for the rest of the world. It's transferring technology, but also financially helping. So, so going back to this example, this superior insisted because he was convinced of Laudato Si, and now they are saving, thousands of dollars, if we can speak in terms of dollars, because solar energy is much cheaper, then you don't cause emissions. Then I think of another woman called Living Laudato Si in the Philippines. A few weeks ago, I was in Assisi. I met with a bishop from the Philippines, who is a climate leader. And lots of things are happening. And if you had to ask me, one of the countries responding best to Laudato Si, I would rate the Philippines in the first place, because they are really moving. Whereas in other parts of the world, there's still a lot of inaction. So things are happening, and so there are so many things we can do. But the challenge we are seeing it is also the political community is not moving, because unless policies change, things cannot change. And so there again, we have to put pressure bottom up, because our politicians, they think of next 5 years or so. It's also the fault is also ours, because we won't vote, most of us, for a political party that will ask us to make sacrifices. But even economically, very often we quote them. If you have to act now, they say, this was discussed by Nicholas Stern, World Bank economic advisor to the World Bank. He said, he came to the Vatican also for a conference. He said, if you had to act now, it will cost us 3 to 5% of GDP. But if you don't act now, and if we are postponing action, by the end of the century, it's going to cost us 15 to 20% of GDP. So, there's going to break down, economic breakdown. So there's every reason we need to act now. And there are many of these actions, and I really hope that the small things that we do with communities, that we create momentum, and that's still missing. We are, as I said, a very tiny minority. I want to conclude here. I think one secret is to involve, because I think one mistake we made was we left it just to politicians. We left it to technical experts, scientists. No, if our common home is in danger, we need everyone to come together. We need scientists, we need politicians, we need economists, we need business, and I know some very good business people wanting to do something. We need businesses, we need women, we need indigenous communities, we need poets. Some of you would have seen, we came out with a Laudato Si movie with Pope Francis. In 1 month's time, only in English, we had 8 million views. So it was one way of creating awareness. So we need artists, we need everyone. So this is, I think, one secret will be there, how to get everyone together, all disciplines, people from all walks of life to come together. We might succeed. I'm sure we'll succeed, but time is running out. I always want to give this caveat. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Father Josh. Is there any other question from our audience? No? Well, apparently there aren't. So, oh no, yes. Anna Maren Kosen.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. I was wondering, I mean, in the sense of us coming together in order to tackle climate change. In my church in the Netherlands, I've seen a lot of, well, sort of polarization within our church community too, of people well, wanting to actively tackle the issue, and then people being very critical of climate change. And that has caused quite some heated discussion. Wait, I don't have my video. Let me see if I can. Anyways, and I was wondering if maybe you, Father, have any idea on how to tackle such well, such discussion and tackle such polarization within the church communities.
Yeah, thank you, Anna Marine, and yeah, I'm at all the solutions, but then a couple of things come to my mind, and we have raised a very important point, because polarization is a huge challenge we are facing now. I think one reason is also because these issues were discussed in the last few decades. Look at the United States, for example, where to be concerned about the environment, you have to be a Democrat, almost 90%. And if you're belonging to the Democratic Party, you might be sympathetic. And because environmentalism was very shallow, and that's the reason when Pope Francis speaks of common home, that's a much more promising approach. It's when my home is in danger, all of us need to come together. And the polarization is, again, going back to the US. I hope there could be listeners from the US who can step in. That sometimes are contradictory, because you would find those who are very much for the environment, but they were not worried about poor people. They were worried about protecting rare species of animals, which are all very good. I'm not denying that, but they were not worried about children dying of hunger. And Laudato Si, Pope Francis says, these are two Christs put together. On the other hand, again, going back to polarization, we have groups who are so much pro-life, they want to defend life, against abortion, but they are not worried about migrants. They're not worried about the, death penalty. They're not worried about old people, about human justice. So it's a contradiction. So we need to expose these contradictions. So in a way, Laudato Si goes beyond those facile, easy polarization. That's why sometimes it's difficult to place Pope Francis. Sometimes the people think he's too much on the left. Sometimes people think he's too much on the right. The thing is, he has gone beyond that. And that's what we need to do. That's where I find speaking about our common home can be a much more promising approach. And if I can also quote an example, I remember once in Chicago, they were narrating to me a deacon who is very much concerned about climate crisis, and he was speaking to an audience like the one you're mentioning, and there was this polarization. At one moment he said, let's now think of our grandchildren. Then he showed some graphs, and he said that changed the discussion. I spoke about the court cases that are going to come up in the European court. One case is from Switzerland, from grandmothers suing the Swiss government, saying that you are endangering the lives of our grandchildren. There's a group of grandmothers coming together and suing the government because they're worried about what their grandchildren are going to inherit. And I also spoke about Professor Joachim von Braun, a top scientist who was worried about. So we need to bring in the human face. So that could be one solution. But in all this, it's just not about numbers and statistics and graphs. And then that's where I think scientists, most of them are not good communicators. They don't need to be. They have top scholars, and then we are grateful to them for the studies they come out with. But very often, when in television discussions, or they were pitched against people who are very good in twisting information and fake news, and they were not able to stand the challenge. So whereas we need to show the human face of the problem, that that's why I always like to quote, and these examples, first of all, I feel that pain. The people think of people in South Sudan not able to go into work because of the droughts. So these are examples. So these are so sometimes when people say the climate is not changing, it's okay. Let's see. Let's call and listen to somebody from South Sudan, or somebody from Africa who is or Congo who has lost everything in a flood, or so we need to bring in the human dimension into our discussions. Real stories, listening to testimonies, not only of suffering but also hope. I mentioned the Philippines is doing so well, and that's also encouraging that some of the leadership is coming from the global south. And as a priest, I think the change will come from below, and simple people, ordinary people will guide change. We need to come together, work with them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Josh. There is again a question from Sir Zan, or a comment maybe, please.
he was applauding.
He was applauding. I don't know. Oh, okay. So shall we move forward with your final conclusion, Joaquino, then? I leave the floor to Joaquino Campese, member of the Scalabrinian congregation, of the Scalabrinians, Roman Catholic religious order, of course, as you know already. He's serving as professor of theology of human mobility at the Pontifical Urbaniana University here in Rome, and he worked with the Scalabrini International Migration Institute here at Simi. He is also president of the Agenzia Scalabriniana for Development Cooperation, which is an NGO of the Scalabrinian congregation that operates in the areas of integral welcoming, intercultural engagement, and development cooperation in Europe as well as in Africa. He studied theology in Manila, Philippines, Chicago, and in Rome, where he earned a PhD in theology of mission. He has been ministering with migrants and refugees in Mexico, USA, and Italy. And he has authored and edited several books and articles on the theology of migration and the pastoral care with migrants and refugees. Thank you, Joaquino, for your final remarks.
Yes, thank you very much for the long introduction. And first of all, I really would like to thank personally Professor Kuretadam, Father Josh, because really the presentation was so rich, was so, and so, I mean, solidly based also on the latest scientific findings and studies. That is really important. I would like to just to raise a few points, but starting from the presentation that was given, and you know, I would like to start raising these points by using keywords. And the first keyword is common home, you know, that we have been repeating, you know, the care for the common home. Because, you know, despite the fact that we have reflected, beginning with two Roman Catholic documents, this is not a Roman Catholic issue. Our common home is not just, you know, the Roman Catholic, the Lutherans, or the Muslims, or the, I don't know, or the Italians, or the people from the USA, or the Indians. Our common home is really our common home. It is the earth in which we live. And you know, what is being said is you know, is something in which all of us are called to participate. I believe those seven goals, you know, that you have listed, you know, at the end of your presentation. I think they are valid for everybody, you know. And you know what I was thinking also, that maybe we might not find you know, partnership within our ecclesial communities, within, you know, the Roman Catholic Church, or the Lutheran Church, or within but we might find it in, you know, with other people, with other religion, with people who do not have a religion, you know, but who want really to work for the care of our common home. You know, in order to reach that critical mass and to join that critical mass, I think we have to work with everybody, because it is, again, we are talking about something that, you know, that interests everybody in this world. So this is my first my first point, my first you know, reflection. The second thing is controversy, because we might think that you know, maybe for some of us, we think that this is something which everybody could agree. But then we have just heard from Holland, but we hear that in the USA, here in Italy, everywhere in the world, that even in our own ecclesial communities, there is polarization, you know, about this issue. And it was interesting. I was reading really at the beginning of Laudate Deum, Pope Francis was talking about resisted derision about, you know, all the talk that we are doing about the climate crisis. You know, there are people who are resisting. There are people who are even deriding, you know, saying, you know, this is a laughable thing. This is ridiculous. What you are saying is ridiculous. And I say this because you see, there is something in common also here between the migration and the climate crisis. You know, and it is polarization. It is controversy. You know, when we speak about climate crisis, we find out that we are polarized. We are divided. And also, when we speak about migration, the same thing happens. And yet the two things, and at the same time, the two things are so connected. I say this because, you know, just a few days ago, I was reading an article about the situation of farm workers in Honduras, in Central America. And one of the people working there, on responding to climate crisis, was saying literally, you know, climate change for me is synonymous with migrants, is synonymous with migration. You know, if there is climate change, people will be moving, people will be going out, people will be abandoning, you know, the places in which they have lived for centuries, you know, for generations. And, you know, we have to be aware that, that there are these obstacles, and that there is this resistance, and so on. Most probably that should bring us to work harder to reach that, you know, that critical mass, yeah, that we need in order to, and this is my third point, you know, in order to get to that, you know, we talk about ecological apartheid. We have talked. We talk about, you know, ecological, you know, problems, etc. You know, we really need to work hard and harder for an ecological conversion. And so that's, I think that's also the orientation that have been given to us. Those 7 goals. You know, they are you know, orientation toward a very, very important for us ecological conversion. And again, you know, it is for all of us. You know, it is not a denominational issue. It is not just a religious issue. It is a straight human issue. Yes. Let's keep in mind, I want to end with the you know, repeating those 7 goals. Just, you know, to have them clear, maybe to you know, to engrave them in our minds, in our, you know. So respond to the cry of the earth, respond to the cry of the poor, ecological economics, adoption of simple lifestyles, ecological education, that awareness, we have to reach, really, we have to work for that, to raise awareness, ecological spirituality, and then community engagement and participatory action. So I believe for all of us, you know, we have to leave this webinar with that responsibility, to work and to you know, to raise awareness about the 7 goals, and to work, you know, personally and also as communities to really to reach, you know, this 7 goals, to participate in order to then get to that critical mass that will really, you know, create that change that we need vis-a-vis a reality that sometimes is really scary, from what also Father Josh Strom was telling us. Okay. I see that Father Josh also shared in the chat, you know, the Laudato Si Action platform. Again, this is not a Roman Catholic thing. This is open to everybody, just as the message of the Laudato Si is open to everybody. I will end reminding you about the next webinar. Our next webinar on the migration ethics and theology will be on October 28th of this year, 2024. Yeah, October 28th. So save the date. And the topic of the next webinar will be migration and development, a Christian perspective. Migration and development, a Christian perspective. So again, I thank all of you who have participated, to all the participants to this webinar, and I thank again Father Jostrom for a very really a beautiful presentation, and we'll see you next time in October. Thank you very much.